Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, today is January 11th, and on January 11th, 1879, the Anglo-Zulu War began. And as I was looking at the list of things that happened on this day in history, they got me thinking that I really don't know as much as I'd like to about what was a pretty significant conflict in African history. So I thought we'd dive into that a little bit today. And we're going to a new channel that I've never done a reaction to before, and it's called History with Hilbert. I'd encourage you to check out some of his other stuff. I'll put a link in the description to the original content. So check him out, give him a like, give him a comment, and check out the video without my commentary so we can support original content creators who are helping us all to learn a little bit more. So today we're going to learn about the Battle of Rorke's Drift, which was one of the significant conflicts of that event known as the Anglo-Zulu War. I've done a video reacting to the Sabaton song about Rorke's Drift, but we've never really taken a deep dive into the real history. There's a movie that was made about it that's got kind of a mix of truth and also Hollywood license, so we'll see what they got right and what they got wrong. Let's dive into History with Hilbert.
The story of Rorke's Drift is of 150 British soldiers who for almost 10 hours held out against repeated Zulu charges during the siege or the Battle of Rorke's Drift from the 22nd to the 23rd of January 1879.
So obviously, for an American audience, the immediate kind of place that your mind goes when we think about events like this, a small force kind of holding out against thousands of enemy, the Alamo. There are some parallels to be had here, but there are also some major differences. Obviously, the Alamo was a several weeks long siege. It was a siege of kind of a hodgepodge collection of militia and some soldiers holding out against a professional army in Mexico. So this is obviously very different, where you've got the professional soldiers being the ones who are holding out against a very well-trained enemy force, but not as well equipped as they were. So some things that are same, some things that are different.
Where the British Empire faced off against the warriors of the Zulu Kingdom. Now, South Africa in 1879 was a mismatch of different nations, the largest being the British Cape Colony, as well as two Boer republics in the north, and the rising Zulu Kingdom, which had risen under Shaka Zulu in the previous century. Now, the Boers, who were these descendants of the Dutch settlers, were often fighting with the Zulus during this time, and especially around the 1880s or the 1879 was between the Blood River area, where they claimed land that had been granted to them by the Zulu king Dingane, although the Zulus refused this, and so there was conflict. Now, one of these Boer republics was in the north, and while the poor was called the Suid-Afrikaanse Republiek.
So I don't know a lot of the history of how South Africa was settled, but I know that there's heavy Dutch influence even in the language today. I think there's a language called Afrikaans, which is kind of a Dutch dialect that's mixed in with some other things. Like I said, don't know a lot about it, but obviously by this point, it's the British who control much of this area. It's the British Army that we're talking about. This is right in the middle of the heavy point in history when Africa has been heavily colonized by a number of Western European nations.
Although the British called it Transvaal. And during this time they had lots of internal conflict as well as a border conflict with the other large Boer republic, the Oranje Vrystaat. And so in 1877 the British decided to annex the Suid-Afrikaanse Republiek. The next step for the British to fully federalise South Africa, as they were doing in Canada at the same time, was to deal with the independent Zulu Kingdom to the southeast, which would then allow them to create a federation in South Africa. But of course the Zulus very much enjoyed having their own freedom, so the British sent them an ultimatum with ridiculous demands that they knew they could never comply to.
This is another theme in history, right? World War I starts out of a list of outrageous demands that couldn't be complied to, even though almost all of them were complied to. Sometimes people don't do things because they're really interested in resolution. They do it because they're interested in making it look like they did everything they could, right? So that's what's happening here. Look, we tried to find a peaceful resolution, but we had no choice but to go to war.
And indeed, the Zulus only complied to two of the somewhat like 10-15 demands that they set, and so the British decided to invade Zululand with several different columns. Of course, they were very confident of victory, as they had highly superior technology to the Zulus and thought that an indigenous foe would be easily enough to defeated. However, the Zulus were to prove them decisively wrong at their first engagement at the Battle of Isandlwana on the 22nd of January 1879. This being because although they had much inferior technology to the British of course using firearms while the Zulus were using short spears and shields made of oxen hide, actually managed to envelop the British positions by using the horns of the buffalo, where they sent 2 flanking troops around while the loins of the buffalo, so
So basically what he's talking about is this is the strategy that the Zulus were trained in, and it was the idea of the loins of the buffalo, so to speak, being kind of the rear force, and then coming out from that were 2 enveloping forces that would come around and hit the flanks while the loins hit the front. And it worked really well for them in other wars against other neighboring tribes and even intertribal warfare. And it works here, but it doesn't work so well at Rorke's Drift, which is actually kind of an offshoot of this Battle of Isandlwana. And these are the battles that the movies Zulu and Zulu Dawn are about.
First line to go forward soaked up the British fire. This resulted in some 1,300 British casualties and remains to this day the costliest defeat in British military history against an indigenous foe.
Yeah, they're basically wiped out, and then, like I said, it's a offshoot of this force that's going to go deal with Rorke's Drift, which is what we're talking about here. And one of the reasons why we're going to have so many Victoria Crosses, which is kind of the British Empire equivalent to the Medal of Honor here in the States, is because they're trying to show, and they're going to really talk up Rorke's Drift because they need to focus on the positive after the absolute disaster that was in Isandlwana.
And of course the Zulus were technologically, although perhaps not tactically, far inferior to the British, and this really sent shockwaves through the British Empire, which had been believed to be almost undefeatable, especially by a native foe like the Zulus.
And it's important to point out what he's saying there, which is the whole difference between technology and tactics. Number one, yes, the Zulu did have some firearms, so they weren't just all spears and shields, but this was not just some mob of kind of aimlessly charging indigenous peoples. These were highly trained warriors who had advanced battlefield tactics, and they used them very effectively.
One of these columns that had been sent in and was actually left behind by the main army that went to Isandlwana was left behind at a missionary post on the Buffalo River at a place called Rorke's Drift, which had been set up by Swedish missionaries earlier in the century. And now they were, of course, out only 6 miles away from the battlefield of Isandlwana, and the Zulus knew that they were there.
And they were aware of what had happened at Isandlwana because word got back to them about that, and they could obviously probably hear the fighting going on 6 miles away. There may have been acoustic shadow, which sometimes happens depending on the way sound travels, but it's likely they probably heard the fighting going on, and we know word got back to them, so they were aware of what was coming.
And of course, here at Rorke's Drift would be the second major engagement of the Anglo-Zulu War following the catastrophe of Isandlwana. So the British forces left behind there were a total of 152 soldiers. 141 were British regulars and 11 were colonial troops. I believe there were 1 or 2 Boers there. I know there was a Swissman there, as well as a few Swedes. And there were 100 native Natal horsemen, who I believe were led by a Colonel Henderson. Now the Zulu forces that came to attack Rorke's Drift on the river were a total of around 3,000 to 4,000 men. And a few of these would have had firearms, although of course they were not trained in them. Many of them would have taken them from the bodies of the British they'd killed at Isandlwana, and most of them were out of date and old, and so they weren't really as well drilled as the British, although they did have them. Although the majority of Zulus, as I already said, would be armed with the short spear called the assegai, and the shields made of oxen hide, cowhide, and they would fight in the traditional manner, as well as using throwing spears and things like that. So this is a map of Rorke's Drift, and actually what the British did to defend themselves against the Zulu attack that they knew would come in a melee style, rather than the traditional European style of just shooting at each other.
And yeah, and that's what you should do. When you have 3,000 to 4,000 men and you're taking on 150 or so, or however many are actually fighting here, that are armed with much better weapons, you've got to just hit them with everything you've got as quickly as you possibly can.
at each other from not very far away, was to construct sandbags around the area. And they did this with a huge wall called the Mealy Bag Wall to protect the soldiers on the inside. Now, as well as this, they also created an inner wall called the Biscuit Bag Wall and a redoubt, which is sort of this circular formation of sandbags.
And it's important, to see all of this because, again, we know they knew they had time, and so they prepared. Could they have gotten out of there? Maybe. I don't know. But I think they had some wounded and they had some people who they would have had to leave behind, and so they decided to stay and fight.
Or in case they needed to retreat from the larger part of the Mealy Bag Wall at the end of the battle. Now, behind this wall, the British soldiers and their allies waited for the Zulu attack to come, which it soon did around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Now, the first Zulu attack actually swung around the south wall and then slammed into the north wall around the hospital, where the British obviously had troops stationed, so this again was some kind of Zulu decoy. And actually, at this first stage of the Zulu battle, the Zulus discovered that the sandbag wall that the British had constructed was too high for them to get over. Obviously, they had to get over the wall so that they could use their assegai, their spears, on the British, because they were a melee kind of attack rather than the ranged attack of the British. But this was too high, so what they started to do was to climb over the bodies of their own dead, obviously to try and poke through the wall, and to sit underneath the wall and try to grab the rifles of the British, as well as to fire up if they had firearms and kill the British. And actually, quite a few of the British casualties during the war, during the Battle of Rorke's Drift, were from these firearms by the Zulus who were crouching underneath the wall to attack them. But ultimately, this first attack was successfully repulsed by the British behind the sandbags. And now actually a second attack also came, and this was much more around the western edge of the defences. And this attack was much harder to repel for the British, and actually they then gave the order to retreat from the outer bag of the Mealy Bag Wall and into this second line of defense that they had constructed. Obviously, this.
So it's always important, and it's good military tactics to have a backup plan, have a fallback plan, have contingency plans, because we know that plans never survive contact with the enemy, because you don't know what the enemy's going to do. And so now they're falling back to their fallback position. They're going to set up, they're doing exactly what they had already thought through they would need to do.
This was a much smaller area to defend, so they could have many more rifles over a much smaller area, and so it would be a lot harder for the Zulus to storm. However, in doing this, although this was a fighting retreat and it was successful that the men were able to get into their new positions, this did mean that the hospital was now isolated, and there were several wounded men from Isandlwana who had escaped in the hospital, and this led to a very valiant defense of this hospital. And actually 9 out of the 11 men who were trapped inside the hospital were able to fight their way out and rejoin the others, as is depicted in the film Zulu, as many of the events here are. And Zulu is actually quite an accurate representation of what went on at the battle.
And I talked a little bit in my video about the song Rorke's Drift about some of the inaccuracies. Most of the inaccuracies are either minor things or just timeline issues, like referring to the regiment here as the South Wales Borderers, which they weren't yet. That was a name and a distinction and identity that came a few years later. In fact, there were Welshmen in this unit that was defending, but it was not a Welsh unit. In fact, I think it was stationed in the British West Midlands. It was kind of like a Staffordshire, Birmingham area thing. And so like them singing Men of Harlech as they do was not something that would have happened. But
if you're interested. Now, this then led to the final Zulu attack, both coming from the eastern side, or the western side, as the Zulus had come over the Mealy Bag Wall and attacked this second line, this Biscuit Bag Wall that the British had constructed, as well as through the cattle kraal, the kraal being this word for the kind of enclosure that they had for cattle in South Africa. And the Zulus attacked from both sides, but the British, thanks to their concentration of rifle fire, I think they went down from about 20,000 rounds to 900 rounds during this time, so they came really close to being out of ammunition.
Wow, think about that. They fired, nearly 20... let me hear that number again.
Rounds to 900, concentration of rifle fire.
20,000 to 900?
I think they went down from about 20,000 rounds to 900 rounds.
So they fired nearly 20,000 rounds of ammunition. at this group of a couple of thousand Zulu warriors. So this shows you how intense and how long this lasted. I'm honestly really surprised it lasted as long as it did and that the Zulu didn't overwhelm them. And that tells you a little something either about the nature of the Zulu attack or the nature of how well planned and well set up this fortification and this defense was.
During this time, so they came really close to being out of ammunition. They kept up a volley fire, and this ultimately was able to repel the Zulu attack as they kept coming. And actually the Zulus kept attacking through the night as well, so the British were fighting, standing in their positions, fighting for hours and hours. And it seemed that the Zulus would keep attacking until the British ran out of ammunition. But they're also...
And put yourself in the mindset of these British soldiers, as you know. As long as we've got ammo, we've got a chance. But when we run out of ammo, now we're fighting their fight, right? We're fighting a melee action. They've got the numbers. There is no chance if we run out of ammunition.
So came an end to the Zulu desire to carry on the fight. And actually they did retreat in the morning hours at around dawn. And so the British finally got a rest after about 10 hours of fighting. And it's because of this that 11 Victoria Crosses were handed out to people at Rorke's Drift. And obviously out of 150 soldiers, 11 is a huge amount. Victoria Cross was a massive honour. Although it's possible that this was only to compensate for the terrible defeat of the British force at Isandlwana.
Which is what I mentioned earlier. That's a pretty common way of looking at this. And a lot of people subscribe to that theory that this was a propaganda tool. But that said, 150 men fighting for 10 hours to hold off thousands, you're going to have some acts of incredible heroism in there. So I don't want to completely discount and say that these 11 men did not in any way deserve the Victoria Cross.
Of course, it was on the same day as the Battle of Isandlwana and into the next day, the 23rd of January. So it's possible that they wanted to essentially bolster the victory at Rorke's Drift to compensate for their loss.
Both can be true.
Although it goes without saying that the valiant defense of Rorke's Drift by the British soldiers and the very brave attack of the Zulu warriors, who of course were charging in with essentially Stone Age weapons while the British were firing modern firearm technology, both shouldn't be forgotten and are in their own right very impressive as a last stand. And I think we should remember everyone who fought at the Battle of Rorke's Drift. All right, everyone, so
yeah, hey, that was good. Great stuff there. History by Hilbert, so check him out. I have the link in the description. And if you want to see my video where I did a reaction to the song Rorke's Drift, which shows a lot of the clips from the movie about the Battle of Rorke's Drift, I'll put that link in the description as well as put it up here on the screen so you can check that out. Thanks for watching.